Welcome back. If you were to read the entirety of the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas, which extends over 5 volumes in the English and has some 30,000 densely printed pages, you'll find one doctrine painfully lacking. There is no time given in this massive theological work to the doctrine of the church. One of the reasons for this is that the church is so familiar. We all go to church, right? We know what the church is because we experience it as Christians. However, it is this familiarity that breeds confusion regarding this teaching. James Leo Garrett, in his Systematic Theology, states that before the Reformation, there was actually no need to define the church, for there was one church. However, even in this, there was an ignored confusion. Why was the Eastern Church not recognized fully by the Western Church, and vice versa after 1054 AD? So it was the Reformers and their realization that the church had become corrupt right up to the pinnacle of power, the Pope, that started to question and therefore in part define what constitutes the true church. However, as McIntyre points out, like today, the Reformers spent most of their time discussing the church in terms of its relation to other entities. For the Reformers, it was the true church and not the Roman church. Today, we make a similar mistake. The church is not a social club. It's not a political organization, etc. These are useful in starting the debate. However, they lack a positive definition of what the church actually is. Erickson, I think, is profoundly helpful here, as he starts this chapter showing that there is so much confusion regarding the church, and then breaks the discussion into 2 parts: the empirical dynamic definition of the church and the biblical philological definition of the church. Now, I want to encourage you, read through these carefully and understand why Erickson wants to have this in mind before he gets to the biblical images of the church. We must have in mind certain concepts if we are going to do justice to the theology of the church. Now, certain questions must remain at the forefront of our minds. What is the relationship between the local church and the universal church? How can we know the local body of believer is actually related to the church universal? And how do we define these things? These are questions we need to be asking. These are great ways to pass the discussion. And I would suggest reading carefully of Erickson here. After this, Erickson spends some time in the next part discussing the biblical images of the church. See how the Bible uses images to paint what we are to understand and what the church is and what it is not. And the last part of Erickson's chapter is looking at what he calls the special problems. Erickson here gives almost an introductory level engagement on some of these really deep theological discussions. And these include the relationship of the church to the kingdom, the church to Israel. What is the relationship between the church visible and the church invisible? And when was the church incepted? The textbook, your textbook, invites you to go deeper. However, you will need to find monographs that tackle these topics as a whole. They're just too deep to cover in a systematic work. They're very interesting discussions, and I would encourage deeper engagement here. But for the sake of this course, the introductory knowledge that Erickson gives us will be suffice. The wonder of the church is that all believers are a part of it. We are the body of Christ. And surely in this, we're invited to know what that means, what this looks like, and how this glorifies God. And so I encourage you, dive as deep as you can into these wonderful topics. As always, I hope that this motivates you to worship, to love Christ and love what Christ loves, his church, his bride. Now, I would also call, as you study, to fall in love with the people of this community, which we call the church, and see how the manifest wisdom of God is revealed in this group of believers. Also remember, as we study, that Christ is building his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And so, I encourage you again to dive in, to drink deeply of this deep and wonderful theology, and in light of that, to truly worship. We'll see you next time.